All right, welcome back to another episode of the Startup Junkies podcast. Before we begin, we would just like to say thank you for joining us wherever you are. Without you, this would not be possible. My name is Matthew Ward, and I'm on the Startup Junkie team. Today, I have my co-host, Jeff Amrine, who is the founder and managing director of Startup Junkie with me. How are you doing today, Jeff?
Oh, I'm doing great. Glad to be here.
Good, good. And before I introduce our awesome guests, we want to tell you a little bit about Tiny Capital. Are you looking to sell your wonderful internet business? Tiny partners with founders to give them quick, straightforward exits that protect their team and culture. They'll make an offer within a week, close the deal within a month, and keep your business operating for the long term. Get in touch at tinycapital.com/startupjunkies, and they'll let you know within a couple of days. Now, today we have with us a special guest from Launch Factory, James Hereford. James is a co-founder and partner of Launch Factory, and prior to Launch Factory, served as a chief of staff for the technology engineering division of Google's hardware product area. Launch Factory is a startup studio with a unique pathway for launching successful companies. Unlike a traditional accelerator or incubator, they don't invest in existing companies. They build new businesses from the ground up. James, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So to kick it off, what led you to co-founding Launch Factory?
Well, Launch Factory was actually kind of the brainchild of my partner, Brad Chisholm. He had started a company before in the technology space that he sold to Google in 2014. And I had interacted with him at that time. And then, he brought me over to Google. And so, I think after he left Google, he kind of was working with several different startups in an advisory capacity and started looking at some data and thought to himself, a lot of these companies struggle for the same reasons and a lot of companies fail for the same reasons. And interestingly, those reasons aren't usually related to their idea or their technology. Like very rarely does a company fail because they couldn't get the product to work. They fail because of business reasons, management execution issues, cash flow, and cash management, that sort of thing. And so, he called me one day and said, "Hey, James, why don't you leave Google and instead of starting one company with me, let's start a whole bunch of companies." And, that was a really interesting proposal to me, and one thing led to another. And that's how we ended up with Launch Factory.
Well, it's very cool. And I want to get into the specifics of how the model works and whatnot. But before we do that, I'm really interested in how a kid from Ponca City, Oklahoma, gets to Google and then California. Talk a little bit about that story. I think some of that origin story stuff is usually pretty interesting to our listeners.
Yeah, so I have come a long ways, and a lot of it I think has been luck in some ways. I've been very fortunate. I left Ponca after high school and went to school at the University of Oklahoma. I studied physics in undergrad. And during my time there, basically a family friend worked at a company in Houston in the seismic industry. And so seismic is really far upstream in oil and gas. It's where you go and make the equipment that oil companies use to find oil with. And so Ken brought me down summer after my freshman year to have an internship. And then a summer after my senior year, I called him back and said, "Hey, Ken, can I come again?" And that led to a job opening. And so I started my career in seismic. And I was there for about 5 years. The first 2, I was working explicitly as an engineer. And then the latter 2.5 or so, I was working as a program manager for a new sensor technology. And that's actually when I originally met Brad Chisholm. My company had contracted with his startup to build this new technology. And so, after a couple of years, we kind of had started to show that, the key performance indicators for that technology weren't fully aligned with our goals. And in the meantime, I had been wanting to go back to grad school for a while. And so I left ION and went to a full-time MBA program at Rice University. And so that was, I think, a big turning point for me, where I, really started trying to push and achieve a lot of things. And so after Rice, when I went to Rice, I actually went with the intention of starting my own company. I said, all right, I'm either going to start a company or I'm going to work in renewable energy or I'm going to be a product manager in a technology company. And 2 years later, I was looking at a lot of student debt, had a baby on the way, and realized that the risk profile of entrepreneurship was just not for me. And so I took that second road and went to work on renewables at Chevron. And that was a really great experience. I got to go and research renewable energy every day. It was fantastic. And about 3 years or so into that, I get a call from Brad Chisholm. And he said, "Hey, James, so I just lost my program manager, and my company was just acquired by a company that may or may not start with a G. Do you want to come to San Diego?" And so, one thing led to another, and he brought me out to San Diego, and then my time with Google started. And so for the first period there, I was a program manager again for sensor technology, and we started to wind that down. And when we wound it down, that's when Brad decided he wanted to leave Google, and then I stayed and moved into a chief of staff role where I led the business operations and planning for a division of about 300 engineers. And that was a really great experience to get to see the nitty gritty of how organizations really run at scale. And so then after about 2.5 years in that role, I get another call from Brad Chisholm, like I mentioned, and he said, "All right, I'm starting this next thing." And so, like I said, it's been a series of connections that I've been very fortunate to have between family connections that got me that first role, and then professional connections with Brad, but it's led me all over the place. It's been a wonderful journey.
Now, it sounds like a great ride, and so that leads us to Launch Factory, which is a venture studio model for our audience that may or may not be familiar with that. Most people have heard of incubator, they've heard of accelerator, they've maybe heard of entrepreneurial support organization. Talk about what's different about the studio model.
Yeah, so the primary difference in a studio model is that we do not invest in entrepreneurs or existing companies. And so, most incubators or accelerators, their mission is to engage with an entrepreneur that already has an idea and help them out along the way. Really not all that different than a venture capital organization that is often doing the same thing. For us, we develop the concept internally, either through our own ideation process, or we source it through partnerships with university tech transfer organizations and some other entities. And then once we have the idea, we take it through a staged due diligence process. And we really like this part about the studio model because we found that in those top 20 reasons that startup companies fail, a lack of due diligence about whether there's a market need, really understanding the customer, it's actually a fairly common source of failure. And so we kind of believe that when entrepreneurs get really excited about an idea, it's very easy to do that due diligence, well, either skip it or do it in a way that maybe isn't completely as critical as it should be. And so with our team, there's no emotional attachment to the idea. We're scanning the marketplace for interesting segments, and then we go through an ideation process. And last year we generated upwards of 1,200 ideas. 90% of them die right there in the brainstorming room right after the session. And then we take the remaining ones through this staged process and really develop a very strong understanding for the customer need and that sort of thing, and become very confident that we want to pursue the opportunity. Once we do that, then that's when we bring founders in and we pair up the founders with the ideas, and then we incubate the company for 2 years. So there's a lot of our model that is very similar to incubators and accelerators, particularly in that tail end. But that first part where we identify the concepts, that's very different.
Yeah, and it's a capital intensive business that you're involved with. So do you have an attached fund, or you have to go through a regular raise process as you deplete that initial investment you make, or how's that look? Because when we look at startups, sometimes it may be 7 to 12 years before you get any kind of exit event to repay and replenish that sort of an initial fund. What's your thinking around that? How's that part of it work?
Yeah, so we do have an internal fund. We actually just closed our first fund in December of last year for $2.5 million to fund 2021 operations. And so that funds the $300K that goes into each of the newcos, as well as our internal operations for the following year. The companies have 2 years of incubation, and so that $300K is meant to take them throughout that incubation period. And during that time, the founders are actually allowed to withdraw up to $50K per founder per year in compensation, which I know is not a huge salary, but it's a lot better than the $0 that most entrepreneurs deal with. And it's meant to give people who might not otherwise be able to pursue an opportunity, an entrepreneurial opportunity, it gives them the ability to kind of breathe and potentially do that. And we believe that that opens our pool to where we can get the best founders at all times.
Are you drawing people in nationally, or is it a residency deal where they've got to be in Southern California? How do you work that part of it?
So during our recruitment process, they can be anywhere in the nation. If they're selected as founders, we do ask that they come out to San Diego and stay there for at least 2 years during incubation. After that, it's their company. They can take it wherever they'd like.
Gotcha. Matthew, over to you.
Yeah, so when the founders come and apply to be part of this program, what if it's just a solo founder? Is there some way that they meet and try to connect? Is there some sort of platform, or how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So our recruitment process, I think, is the part of Launch Factory that is really unique. You know, when it comes to a studio model, there's about 450 startup studios around the world. That part's not, you know, it's rare, but it's not unique. As far as I know, nobody recruits founders the way we do, though. And so the way it works is essentially an open call. Anyone can come and participate. The only requirement we have is a bachelor's degree or equivalent experience. Beyond that, our process is going to measure everything. And so individuals come in, they participate in teams of 2. And throughout the recruitment process, they will submit work samples that are relevant to the company that they want to lead. And we will evaluate those. And so as an example, in the first phase, we will give them a package of market research that we've done. That's just the data. We remove all the conclusions that we've drawn. And we say, hey, produce a market report and talk to us about some of the insights that you see from this data. And then it progresses, you know, the next phase is product definition and then go to market strategy. And over 7 weeks, what it really builds into is, on the business side, a business plan, a very draft stage, early plan. And then on the technical side, a functional prototype of a single use case for the product. And each week, only the highest performing teams will move forward. And so by the time you get to week 7, there's only 3 teams remaining for each company. And those 3 teams have an opportunity to pitch their vision for the company to a panel of experienced VCs and angel investors. And we'll work with that panel, and they help us make that final selection. And then those 2 individuals would then become the founders of the new company. And so, Matt, you asked about what if a solo entrepreneur comes. So about 80% of our applicants are solo entrepreneurs, and they don't have that co-founder yet. And so what we have, after you finish your application and you log into our website, we have a dedicated candidate area where they can search through all of the other co-founders that are out there looking. And so they can search for whether or not the person wants to be a CEO or CTO, or which company they want to pursue. They can also search on the basis of skills. So like, I'm a business guy. If I was doing it, I could go on and say, find me a software engineer. And so they can filter, you know, the 200 some odd applicants that are currently in the database. They can filter that down based on location, skills, role, opportunity, etc. And then they can message them on the platform and get a conversation started. And we encourage them to talk to as many as they can. And because we found that the ones that are really successful, they'll interview 10, 15 other founders before they find that person that's the right mix. And so that's the first tool that we have. And then the second is that we host co-founder search events. And we actually have several last week, and then we have several this week and next week. And the way those work is they're essentially speed networking events. So we'll bring together people, we put them in a room, we rotate them around in 6-minute increments, and it gives everybody a chance to meet one another.
It's really cool, dynamic, and it's, entrepreneurship and startups, particularly scalable startups, there's no escaping the reality that it's a very Darwin-driven process. And by virtue of having that sort of fly-off or that competition that progresses each week, you really separate the people that kind of get it, that can develop the knowledge of what needs to happen and that have kind of execution prowess, versus the ones that might not. they're ultimately not going to be successful. What have you found to be the biggest challenges now that you've been running this for a while? What are you finding?
So, obviously there are a variety of operational challenges with respect to sourcing the ideas, finding the founders, etc. I think the biggest thing has just, at least for me personally, it's been the scaling process. So in 2019, we had one company. In 2020, we did two. This year, we're doing four. And we hope to get up to 10 in our office each year. And what I've found is that what you need to do for operations and planning and how you manage the team, that does need to change over time as your organization grows. And I'm sure that's something that every successful startup has experienced. And so, that's always an interesting experience and a bit of a challenge. I think beyond that, for us, one of the biggest things I think is the education challenge with respect to bringing in founders. And so what we found is, whether we post a video online or have a blog article, or regardless of what we put on our website, we're having to simultaneously educate people that, there is such a thing as a startup studio. So, a lot of people don't know that model. Mm-hmm. And then we have this unique recruitment process, and we have to kind of educate them about how that's going to work. And then we have the equity split and the funding model and the incubation process. And we have to tell them about, okay, well, here are all the benefits of this. And so that, I think, has been one of our biggest challenges, and where we're really always trying to spread the word as much as possible, because we believe that this opportunity, it opens doors to entrepreneurship for people that otherwise could never pursue it, but who could be amazing, amazing founders. And it's a really good opportunity, but it doesn't do anyone any good if they don't know that it's there. And so, that's the challenge that we're always trying to overcome.
Well, at the end of this podcast, there'll be 100 countries full of people that will know all about Launchpad.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which is exciting. And the other part is, as I look at your model, and I think about where you sit, are you looking at any sort of demand-driven open innovation from large companies that can use you as a way of spinning things out, and maybe they toss somebody in there that they would otherwise lose, that's great technically or could be a good entrepreneur, but they're in a larger enterprise? Are you thinking along those lines as well?
So we do have a lot of candidates. In fact, I would say the majority of our candidates are employed full-time somewhere. And so we designed the process such that all of the work occurs on the weekend. And so, because we don't want it to be biased towards unemployed individuals. And we try to design each week's tasks such that they'll take no more than 10 hours per founder per week. And just to make sure that it's manageable. So, but in regards to the corporate partnerships, there are a lot of studios out there that are either fully embedded with a corporation, or do kind of innovation for hire type engagements and help larger companies innovate and spin new companies out of them. And that's something that we have looked at very closely and are continuing to investigate. So I cannot say that we are currently operating in that model, but it is an area that we're looking at very closely, and we may see some developments there over the next couple of years.
Fantastic.
I think something that would be interesting was if you could get a deal with Netflix and go through the whole process and from recruitment to the meeting of the founders to funding and seeing how they grow. I think that would be really neat. Even on YouTube, that would be cool just to see how that all plays out, like a reality TV in a sense.
Yeah, it's often the first thing that comes to people's mind, and we've thought about it a lot, because we have great candidates, they have great backstories, the process itself, there's kind of some drama there. We even have teams that blow up because the two founders don't work well together. About 20% of teams will implode mid-process. So I think there's a very interesting premise there, but none of us on the team have backgrounds in video production or TV or anything like that. So we haven't gone down that road as of yet, but who knows? Maybe one day it'll come.
That's one of those things where you just kind of redneck your way into a YouTube channel and start throwing it out there. I mean, our podcast is pretty well established now, but in the beginning, it was an excuse to drink beer on a Friday afternoon to talk about what was ever on our mind at the time. So you should probably give yourself more credit. I mean, if you think that's interesting, get an intern or somebody that you're working with that's got some of those skills, and then just do it. See what happens. Could be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. It may be one of those things that we just need to, get out there and try. But it's also been a prioritization thing for us as well. We've been scaling very rapidly over the last couple of years.
I bet. And given where you sit, I mean, there is equal measure of life science and wireless and probably SaaS and software down there. Do you bias towards one particular sector, or are you open across multiple different sector possibilities?
Yeah, so that is one area where Launch Factory is a bit unique, because there are a lot of incubators and studios out there that do have specific industry verticals that they play in. We do not. We stay open to a lot of different areas. And the primary reason is that we prioritize finding concepts that meet a certain set of business criteria. So, we want to see potential for $100 million plus exit. We want to see fundable milestones within the first 2 years, because that 300K only gets you so far. And so, the whatever concept it is, we have to be sure that around month 12 or 15, we're going to be able to hit a milestone that we can go and raise a seed round on. And there are a variety of other considerations like that with respect to our specific operating model and the funding and the founders that we prioritize, rather than saying, okay, this is a specific industry that we play in.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense.
With the $300,000 that you invest in the company that gets through all the different stages, is there a certain form of investment that Launch Factory prefers, like equity, safe, convertible debt, or is it, what's the flexibility from both sides on that end?
Yeah, so the first couple of years we used a convertible note. This year, actually, now that we have our fund, it will be a priced round. And so the founders will come into a company that has just received 300K on a 1.25 million valuation, and that price round will be on the books going forward, which we believe is actually going to be attractive for subsequent investment rounds. Well, particularly attractive for the founders with respect to subsequent investor rounds.
Along with that, how much does Launch Factory help with finding additional investment during that 2-year period?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked. There's a variety of things that we do. So we do not go and fundraise for the founders, but we advise and coach them through our incubation process throughout that. And we will leverage our network to the extent that we can to help the founders with fundraising. And so what that means is, we have a fund, and everybody that's in that fund that is already invested in the company, well, they're going to be interested in seeing how those founders have developed. And so there's definitely that opportunity. And then there's our broader network. And the last thing, the thing that's very specific, we have something that we call the Strategic Exit Committee. And so this consists of Kim King, who's a former VC and one of our partners, as well as Brad and a couple other high-level individuals that are very well networked in the VC space. And the committee basically is formed the moment the company is formed. And in that first week or two, they will start working directly with the founders about thinking strategically about a future exit. Even though that's 5 years, 7 years down the line, however long it might be, from day one, we want to think about, okay, how are we going to exit? And that means, how are we going to raise funds along the way? And so you have this dedicated committee of advisors that Launch Factory compensates. The new code doesn't have to do that, but the founders have that resource from day one, working with them and helping them figure out, okay, how much money are we going to need to raise? When do we need to raise it by? Who should we be talking to raise those funds? What's our ideal target investor? And how do we map that out over time until it gets us to some type of exit or liquidity event?
We're at the point in the podcast where we typically start to think about landing the plane a little bit. And we've got one sort of standing question that we always ask. If you could go back in time and talk to that engineer, that physicist that was coming out of Ponca City, out of University of Oklahoma, and you knew you could take the knowledge that you know now and you could kind of give your earlier self some advice, what would that bit of advice be?
I'm not sure how helpful this will be for other people, but particularly when I think about my younger self and, some of my shenanigans, it would be focus. I would tell my younger self, you know, apply yourself more and focus and, pick a couple things that you're going to be really interested in and go and dig into those and work on them hard. Just because, like I said, around that time that I went to Rice, for me, that was a very big personal transition. I kind of shifted from being very unfocused to really focusing on my career and progressing it. And I think that's something that, there's probably a lot of young people out there that are like me that could benefit from just that notion of pick something and apply yourself to it.
Yeah, highly creative people and people with that entrepreneurial spirit tend to be shiny object people. And,
Yeah.
when I was young, we didn't know what attention deficit disorder was. Now I know because I've lived it as being kind of a shiny object guy.
Yeah.
James, thanks for coming on. I think the Launch Factory is really an interesting approach to the studio model. How can our audience find out more about possibly participating or applying to participate as a founder, or maybe even from the investor side? What's the best way for them to find you?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me today. In terms of how people can find the process, if they go to our website, www.launchfactory.com, from there they can see all the information about the process and apply. Like I said, it's an open application to anyone that has a bachelor's degree or equivalent experience. And I think the same will be true for investors as well. There they can head to our website, they can learn more about the company. They can also feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or my partner Brad Chisholm on LinkedIn, and we'd love to talk with them.
Thanks for coming on. It was great talking to you. Best of luck with this current year, 2021, and we'll be looking forward to you launching some billion-dollar companies over the next few years.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Take care.
Appreciate it, James.